When done properly, the internet, screens, and particularly social media can provide 5 essential elements of adolescent well-being: a sense of control over one's environment, individuation, self-expression, a connection to others, and acceptance. And then there is the abyss. Welcome to App-Propriate, a podcast designed to give you a little taste into the positives and negatives of the most popular social media apps, so that you and your most importants can make more informed, healthy, and safer choices when it comes to interacting through your screens. I'm your host, Joe Langford. Note that I said safer, not safe. Interacting through screens with other humans contains a degree of natural risk, just like real life. And I believe that education leads to empowerment, and I hope this information helps add a degree of safety, social responsibility, and good digital citizenship to your social networking and the conversations you have about it with your family. Today's episode is about consent apps. It's 2020, and with our evolution both culturally and technologically, a new awareness about why and how we need to speak to our young people about consent is emerging. From Aziz Ansari to Cosby to Kavanaugh to Weinstein, we're learning now that the no means no standard we've been relying on for the last 25 years is not enough, and that moving into a yes means yes stance is now necessary. Meaning, if an enthusiastic agreement to physical intimacy didn't happen, it's not totally consensual. This stance marks an evolution in thinking and action. One of the problems is, we've worked so hard since the 80s to get consent into the conversation and dispel some of those old myths around sex and sexuality, only to give a kind of energy and bolstering to another, one that I call codification. Sex is still viewed by many young people as simply a hurdle you have to clear in order to get to the sex. There are even apps for it, where you sit down with someone and record yourself consenting and then bam! Insta-consent. But real consent requires us to go deeper, to be deeper, to approach sex as a collaborative process, not a personal accomplishment, as something we're creating with another person, not something we're getting from them. As teamwork, not like some legally binding waiver that needs to be signed like we're gearing up for paintball. Apps like We Consent and Say Yes or Yes to Sex are some of the most popular apps to try a digital solution. They allow users and their partners to check yes to a pre-populated terms and conditions for sex, punching out confirmations of both consent and protection, sometimes in as little as 25 seconds. But then what? Is it a legally binding contract? No. Have they taken into account the variable definitions of terms? No. Is there room for questions or negotiation outside that binary of yes or no? No. Have they left provisions for changed lines or minds? No. What about any of the sweet and unexpected variables that come up in a sexual situation? No. Is this actually consent then? I'm assuming/hoping all of you listeners just said no in your heads. I personally and professionally find the idea of a consent app stupid. Whether or not they hold up in court, just the fact that these apps exist points to a bigger problem. That being that we, as a culture, have lived so long with fuzzy versions and attempts at consent that we have apparently lost all sight of what true consent actually means. The whole idea smacks of toxic and typical boy culture. Click and save an option to cover your ass so you can touch hers, emphasizing liability over mutuality, protecting your own precious neck rather than someone else's basic human agency, and turning a product theoretically designed to prevent rape into something that looks and feels super rapey. I'm particularly concerned with the small but unfortunate percentage of the population that are drawn to consent apps because they're worried about being charged with sexual harassment or assault. This draw, in my experience, shows that those guys not only are more concerned with getting in trouble for breaking someone's boundaries, rather than being concerned that they actually broke someone's boundaries, but absolutely misunderstand the entire concept of consent. But the best way to explain why consent apps do not work is to explain what affirmative consent is in the first place. Consent can apply to anything, but usually when you hear the word, it's referring to a mutual agreement between two individuals before sex. To put it simply, when a person gives consent, it means they have freely given someone permission to engage in sexual activity without any feelings of obligation or pressure. They do so willingly, enthusiastically, and not forcibly. Simple, right? Not always. In my books, I define consent as an informed, mutual, sober, honest, understood, and revisited agreement. Let's break that down a bit. Consent must be mutual. Equality is the key. People too far below someone else's age range, development, mentality, or authority level cannot legally give consent. And where these lines are can change with time and geography, but the basic idea is that for any sexual activity to happen, both people need to consent or say yes willingly and freely. Consent must be sober. If you're too drunk to drive a car, you're too drunk to drive your genitals. Drunk, high, or unconscious people can't give consent. Consent must be informed. Sexual activity means different things to different people and does not just mean sex. It includes kissing, hugging, making out, cuddling, touching someone's body in a sexual way, as well as all the stuff you can't show on television. The app We Consent's promo screenshot says, "Bill wants to have sexual relations with you. Do you consent? Say yes or no." I'd encourage everyone to go with no on that question. No offense, Bill. Because what does that even mean? If you were to line up 50 people, including Bill, and ask them what they mean by sexual relations, you're going to get 20 different answers. What exactly would I be consenting to in this scenario? The heteronormative default of penises and vaginas? A makeout sesh? Butt stuff? This app is calling for less conversation about sex than you have when ordering a latte. And what would even happen if your barista said, "Would you like a coffee this morning?" and the extent of your response was simply, "Yeah"? Madness. Consent must be honest. True consent cannot be manipulated. A yes after 20 minutes of whining, guilting, bugging, or begging is not actually a yes. Consent is a process with the aim of creating a relationship of respect for bodily autonomy. When apps work to replace these important conversations with vaguely worded contracts, in some of the apps literally, they avoid creating barriers against the two biggest issues that make sexual interactions problematic: issues of power and issues of communication. Consent must be understood. It's not just about getting a yes. Consent also means that people get to say no. Boundaries and comfort levels change throughout both relationships and encounters. Something that sounded fun or frightening a few hours or even minutes ago can suddenly shift along with our feelings about it. Saying yes to something at one point in time does not mean that person is obligated to do it, though apps like Legal Fling market themselves as an actually binding contract. Given that the people most likely drawn to apps like these are probably not super good at using their words anyway, they're probably going to be unwilling or unable to assert themselves vocally if their feelings shift in the moment. And while some of these apps do offer a changed my mind option, it's extremely unlikely that the average person is going to actually pause in mid-act, swipe into their phone, open the app, and change their consent status on a particular position or act. Not to mention that if consent does change, even verbally, but the app indicates that they did consent to that thing 20 minutes earlier, what impact does that have on budding relationships, blurred lines, or a victim's testimony if a boundary is violated? There are already enough barriers to victims of assaults coming forward or being believed without this variable being tossed into the mix. And consent must be revisited. Again, it's a process, not a goal, not a one-time thing. For the next level, the next day, the next date, you and they need to ask again. When I speak about this with teens, I explain that if a relationship or an encounter with someone you haven't known very long is going to involve sex, you should probably talk about it. It's not safe or smart for anyone, but particularly young or inexperienced people, to go into a sexual situation thinking everything has been punched out ahead of time. And it can be awkward to stop and talk about consent or condoms in the heat of the moment, which is why people throughout history have relied primarily on things like nonverbal cues, liquid courage, and the famously 80s no means no to get through it all. When and if someone's feelings, wants, or some other aspect of the agreement needs to change, then partners also need to check in and talk about that. Many young people are worried that conversations about sex histories or needs and wants are going to be awkward. They need to understand a couple of things. One, sex is awkward sometimes. They're thinking they're going to be able to create an awkward-free zone, particularly the first time they get naked with a new person. They are mistaken. And two, if they're thinking that pausing and updating an app preference is going to make it less awkward than just talking about it, that is also a huge mistake. And so this temptation now is to download an app, set up accounts, and opt into your sexual preferences with a drop-down menu and get on with it. Or get it on. But even apart from software glitches and typos, there's no way that all those facets of consent can be solved by something as simple as an app. Consent apps can be seen as an easy, no-muss, no-fuss out for what in reality is an ongoing process of action, boundaries, and communication. That process of consent, like most other aspects of human interaction, is stressful and fun and funny and cringy and simple and complicated and commonplace and kind of weird. While the apps themselves may be ridiculous and less than appropriate for reality-based and respectful sexual activity, the bigger picture ideas behind them, forethought, communication, and safety, are all good goals. Consent apps can help put these things at the forefront of people's minds when approaching sex and relationships, but they cannot replace real-time, warm human interactions and all the variables that happen during them. To learn more about affirmative consent, check out the Date Safe Project at datesafeproject.org, the Consent Primer, a new book by the Consent Academy based right here in my home state of Washington, and or my books, the Spare Me the Talk series, guides to sex, relationships, and growing up, and yes, consent, for modern teens with a whole section in the back written just for you parents. Thank you for listening. I'm Joe Langford. I'm a therapist, a sex and tech educator, and a dad, and I specialize in helping families navigate that intersection of adolescence, sexuality, technology, and behavior. More information about me and my work to promote healthy, positive, and safer sexual and social behavior, both online and off, can be found at my website, beheroes.net.
The advice presented in this podcast is a form of education and is intended to provide general information about common though broad topics that impact underage people. Specific circumstances and facts may make said advice unsuitable and/or other actions necessary for individuals. This podcast is meant to be an adjunct, not a replacement, for IRL experience, professional advice, and good old-fashioned common sense. In addition, much of the information included here can and most likely will change with time, culture, and the rapid development of technology. BeHeroes.net does not seek nor accept any monetary gain or financial support from any social media platform mentioned. BeHeroes.net is committed to providing quality consulting, coaching, product, speaker, and contracted therapeutic services, advocacy, and resources to clients, visitors, customers, colleagues, and fans. Appropriate is produced by BeHeroes.net.